And so we want, the LA Juice of Peace wants to thank Ian Lustick, who is the is going to talk about there is no solution, now what? And he's on the screen already. And let me just say that this goes back, Ian didn't start this right away. In September 2013, he has an op-ed in the New York Times called The Two-State Illusion, which starts by saying the two-state thing ain't gonna work. In 2019, he wrote a book called Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, where he basically says, what we've got is what we've got. And about 6 or 8 months ago, he edited a bunch of scholarly papers by people who basically asked, what are the implications of a one-state reality? And on that basis, we invited him. That was before the whole war started. And so we thank him very much for coming. And I turn the floor over to Ian right now.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and we've got a small but intimate group. We can have a discussion that leverages discussion and questions and answers. I'm looking forward to that. I have some slides, but I know with this well-informed group, I won't have to give as much background as I do with other groups. I will respond directly to what was just said about the two-state solution. In fact, I want to introduce myself a little bit on that score. There may be some of you who actually signed a petition that I developed in 1972, calling for an end to civilian settlement in the occupied territories and the creation of a non-belligerent Palestinian state next to Israel. I organized that along with Jewish students in Berkeley, where I was, in an organization called the Radical Jewish Union. Our little group was called Yesh Breira. There is an alternative, just what Yossi was saying. And we got 450 signatures on that petition, each one struggle. There were only 1,100 settlers in the West Bank beyond the border of East Jerusalem at that time. And the peace movement didn't exist, really, but the people who would later lead it, I remember coming to Berkeley and telling me I was a fool to think that a few settlers in the West Bank could affect or prevent peace in the long run. I wrote that if Israel didn't stop the settlement within 5 to 10 years, the country would lock itself into a political dungeon from which it would never recover. Now, it so happened that I thought that the option for a two-state solution lasted a lot longer than that. I wrote a couple books looking at how the British got out of most of Ireland after ruling it for hundreds of years, and how the French got out of all of Algeria after settling it and ruling it for about a century, for much longer than that, and trying to learn from those cases about what it would take in Israel. And I continued to think through the 1990s in the Oslo process that there was about a 25 to 30% chance that that could be achieved. And I thought that was a relatively high percentage, given how rare it is for this kind of a problem to be solved by an architected, clever compromise solution. In the event, it was not. And by the early 2000s and by about 2010 or 11, I started to realize that my thinking had to change, because I was actually not having very many interesting ideas. Everything was repeating itself over and over again. Nothing was happening. And I was not analyzing the situation properly anymore. I wasn't even interesting to myself. That's when I realized why that was the case. I was using a set of assumptions that were no longer valid. The assumptions that the structure of the problem was one community held at a distance by the Israeli state struggling for its status. As I'm going to be arguing, no, once you see that Israel is the only state between the river and the sea, and that it rules the whole country in different ways, the future kind of opens up to you. You can think more creatively and more effectively about what has been happening, what is happening, and I think what will happen. And there's a test that has been presented to this approach of mine, and that test is this Gaza war. So let's plunge into the presentation and see where it takes us. Toward the end, I will be talking about what I believe will be a renewed effort to implement the two-state solution, and we'll talk about that at that time. So first, although probably this group doesn't need too much in this regard, what is the Gaza Strip? I am pretty amazed by how much ignorance this current war is revealing among people. They don't understand one critical thing, and that is that the Gaza Strip, as we know it today, is part of the state that the UN partition resolution said would be Arab. This is that I'm pointing to here. I assume you can see me pointing. The UN partition plan with Jerusalem as an independent, or excuse me, an international corpus separatum. The gray areas are the Palestinian state, the bluish areas, the Jewish state. Gaza, you can see, is in the middle of this strip alongside, heavily Arab settled. What happened after the UN resolution in November 29 is that a civil war broke out in Palestine, in which Palestinians and Jews were fighting. Even many villages had agreements with the Haganah that they would not attack the Jews, and the Haganah would not attack the villages. In most cases of these agreements, the Haganah broke the agreement, and Plan Dalet was put into effect in the spring of 1948, before Israel was declared a state and before the Arab countries invaded. As a result, these areas that are purple on this map, which were to have been part of the Arab state, were taken over by Jewish forces. Here, Jaffa included, and the Arabs in those areas were expelled either to Jordan or into Gaza, in this entire area and along the apron here, in this along the sides. So a very large proportion of the inhabitants of the Gaza Strip are descendants of the displaced persons who entered this area where the Egyptian army was during the war. This is the only part of Palestine that the Egyptian army remained in. It's called this area, the Fallujah Pocket. And Nasser himself was actually stationed there. About 200,000 displaced persons went into Gaza at that time. I think it's important to use the term displaced persons for this reason. As you probably know, about 250,000 Israelis have been displaced from their homes along the Gaza boundary and in the north, near Lebanon. They've been displaced because of fear of war. They've been displaced because military operations were taking place, because they were afraid, and because they were told to leave. Why do I call them displaced persons? Because no one has said they cannot return eventually. What changed the Palestinians who entered Gaza from this area, from displaced persons into refugees, was the Israeli decision not to allow any of them to return. That's what turns the displaced persons that always are the result of war into refugees. And I say this because it's so often we hear people talking about the refugee problem as if it was created by the question of whether Arabs were expelled or whether they fled. Some were expelled, some fled, some were terrified, some were forced out at gunpoint. What really made the refugee problem, however, what it is today and has been for 75 years, is that Arabs, displaced persons, were not allowed to return. It was seen, their disappearance, their expulsion was seen in Weizmann's terms as a miraculous simplification of our task. It reduced the size of the Arab population in the Jewish state, even as the territory of the country was expanded. Now, in this second map here, we see the refugee having now become refugees because they were not allowed to return. The displaced persons have been inhabiting camps in all of these countries, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon. I thought you might be interested in, I'm a stamp collector, in these two first day issues. These are issued by Israeli Post Office in 1957 when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip briefly after conquering it in November 1956. It held it until March 1957. And you can see Israeli flags flying in Gaza. So even Gaza has had an extensive history passing back and forth out of direct Israeli control, now in Israeli control, as I'll argue, but not a full occupation. It is I should put it differently. It's a very specific form of rule, which I'll go into in a minute. Now, if you look at this slide, what we're talking about is one element that produced what I call the one-state reality. People sometimes act as if the settlements themselves are what is causing what have blocked every attempt to negotiate a two-state solution. That the settlements themselves, the number of settlers, are what prevent there from being a two-state solution, withdrawal from enough of the West Bank and Gaza to create a viable Palestinian state. I don't believe that's the case. What really prevents it is the transformation inside of Israel that has made the country a country that could support a settler juggernaut that has placed now 11% of the Jewish population across the Green Line. So it's that Israel is a completely different country than it used to be. If you use it in American terms, it used to be a kind of blue state. Now I'm getting an echo of my voice. Somebody's got to turn off their mic. Okay? Good, thank you. So it was a kind of blue state in the 60s. Think of Israel as like Connecticut or Minnesota. It then became, in the 80s, a purple state, where it was sometimes Likud government, sometimes labor government, sometimes a very right-wing annexationist government, sometimes a government that was somewhat open to some kind of territorial compromise. Back and forth, it oscillated, more like Pennsylvania or now North Carolina or some purple state, Wisconsin perhaps. But it's now a deeply red state, overwhelmingly right-wing, very hostile to any kind of significant compromise with Palestinians. There is no left in Israel, not a Jewish left, except that which depends on Arab votes for its survival. I put this slide up just on the settlement side, just so you can see what the West Bank looks like now. On the one hand, you can see over here Area C. The only part of Oslo that actually still exists is its division of the West Bank into 3 areas, A, B, and C. Although the only area that really has any integrity is C. Area C was the area that Israel would remain in control of temporarily. In fact, Israel has established itself more permanently in the brown areas of Area C. Area A, it was the small areas around the bigger cities where the PA, the Palestinian Authority, was supposed to have more or less complete control, in which the Israeli army would not enter. Area B was where the Israeli army and the PA would share responsibility. In fact, for quite some time now, the Israeli army and the military has gone into Area B and Area A whenever they want, whyever they want, and for whatever purpose. But they still insist on excluding Palestinians and limiting their activities completely in Area C. If you look at this map over here, we will see how in the area that even was supposed to be a Palestinian in some sort, the yellow areas, those are the areas that are not only heavily settled now, but where the settlers are most active in their encroachments on and attacks on Palestinian communities. You can see that by the location of these colored dots that indicate settler attacks of various kinds on Arabs, and they are in the middle of the country where the densest Arab populations are located. Now, one of the interesting things as a political scientist that I've noticed, and one of the main arguments in my book, and one of the things that we always have to take into account when we're thinking about questions like how to solve a problem or where can we go from here, is that when you're thinking about how states operate and how politics works in the life of states, people have purposes, states have purposes, groups in states have purposes. Let's say your purpose was to create a kind of rectangle. Well, you go ahead and try it, and you get something that's more or less the same color and the same size, but it's not exactly a rectangle. That's typical. When you try to do something, you don't get quite what you want. But what is not often appreciated is the extent to which your unintended consequences are much, much larger than the intended consequences, and they tend to overwhelm them. So when you are thinking about how to plan in politics and achieve things through careful negotiations, it's almost as if you're pretending that you can do brain surgery with sledgehammers. It's that awkward. It's that difficult, especially when you have the kinds of passions involved that you have in this conflict, and when you have relationships with outside powers that are of enormous consequence, like the United States, but who can't be depended on to think that their interests are actually as at stake in the outcome of what happens as are the interests of those who live there. So if we think, for example, of the current situation in which processes of de facto annexation, some opposed by many Israelis and some actively pursued by other Israelis who wanted to create a de facto annexation situation, what we have resulted in is a state from the river to the sea that is not democratic because it does not have representation by half the people who live within it, and which has, by the way, a plurality of Arabs in a state that calls itself Jewish. There are more Arabs living between the river and the sea than there are Jews. That's because there are about 550,000 non-Arab, non-Jews. So you have about 7 million Jews, about 7.3 million Palestinians, and about 500,000 of these non-Jewish, non-Arabs. Now, my point is that out of all this activity, we ended up with something that literally no one wanted. Nobody wanted this. And certainly the left didn't want it, and neither did the Israeli right. It's just an illustration of this way in which unintended consequences swamp intentions. And what we have is, when we go back to Gaza now, what the Israelis have started to call the coastal enclave is one of these unintended consequences. An area filled with immiserated refugees, millions of them, who can see the lands from which many of their grandparents came through the barbed wire, across the barriers, and they cannot do anything but, if it's in a good time, they can go and work there and then go back to Gaza overnight or after a work shift. These are pictures of the Great March of Return in 2018, when masses of Palestinians, to make the point that they were refugees who wanted to return, marched toward the border, mostly non-violently, and were met with lethal force, and as the only way that the military could figure out to stop masses of civilians from just walking into the country. Now, let's look a little more closely at Gaza as a way to sneak up on our problem of what do you do now if I'm saying there's no solution. And I think I should perhaps stop here to explain, when I use the word solution, what do I mean? It's very important to understand that. I think what we heard at the beginning from Yossi is how important it is for him and for others to have a picture of the future that could inspire hope that someday there can be something other than war, some kind of picture of the future that has the minimum requirements, in our view at least, or in whoever's view is making this image, the minimum requirements of each side. Now, that is a pretty picture of the future. I consider two states living side by side, one based in the West Bank in Gaza with East Jerusalem as its capital, one based on the plain in Israel and within the Green Line with West Jerusalem as its capital, or a shared El-Quds Yerushalayim as the capital of both. I consider that a very pretty picture. I have other pretty pictures in my head: a single democratic state where everyone has one person, one vote, or a binational state, or a confederation that includes Jordan, or 3 states, or even a regional confederation, a kind of EU of the Middle East. Those are all very pretty pictures in my mind. They are not solutions. A solution is when you can look at the situation as it is now and think of a way that is plausible and acceptable to get from where we are to one of those pretty pictures. For decades, I believed there was a plausible route from what Israel and the Palestinians were in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, to a two-state pretty picture. Since I no longer see a way to produce a government in Israel capable and willing to engage in that kind of successful negotiation, nor can I see, by the way, without that, a way that Palestinians could produce such a government. Since I don't have that ability to imagine that, and since I know of no one else who has imagined it for me or traced the route to how that could happen plausibly, I consider that there is no solution now. But as I will indicate, because there's no pretty picture to which I know a route to get there. At the end, I'll say that doesn't mean that there's not things to do. There's not action to take. But I want to be clear what I mean when I say that there is no solution. That's what I mean. I don't mean that there are no pretty pictures, although I must admit, within the last 2 months, after the attacks of March 7th and the response, it's even harder. It's even hard to develop those pretty pictures into which one can have some faith. Now back to this slide. We see the Gaza Strip. We see a line around the edge of the Gaza Strip in red and brown. This is a great deal of territory when it's a proportion of the 140 square miles that is in Gaza that Israel has declared as a no-go zone so that farmers can't reliably use that land and so on. It's a security strip. These are pictures of the walls and the barriers surrounding the Gaza Strip. You can imagine what it is for 2.3 million people. You can try to imagine what it is for them to live there. Now, there is a tremendous human cost to what the current situation has been. The situation up to October 7th has been. Israel it is false. It is an absolutely false analysis, even though you hear it commonly, that Israel had Hamas deterred and that deterrence has failed. Israel has not even tried to deter Hamas. Deterrence, for a political scientist, deterrence means you affect the intentions of your adversary so they do not want to attack you. You affect those intentions by threatening them with so much pain that they will not do what they want to do, even though they could attack you. That's deterrence. Israel decided, I think quite some time ago, that it didn't want to try to incentivize the Palestinians or threaten them enough not to try to attack. Instead, they adopted what is called in the professional literature a defensive strategy, not the opposite of offense, but the opposite of deter. A defensive strategy is you actually target the capabilities of the adversary. You destroy their ability to attack, even though you expect they still want to. Deterrence, you would try to stop the attack by convincing them not to try. In defense, you assume they want to try, but you destroy their ability to attack, what Israel calls the infrastructure of terror. And the strategy was every few years to actually more or less invade the Gaza Strip and mow the lawn, as it said, to make sure that enough of the capability of Hamas or the economic capability of the Gaza Strip was destroyed. So it would take a few more years for them to build it back up to be able to attack. That's why it happened every few years. And you can see by this chart in 2008, 2009, 2014, 2018, 2021, how many assaults occurred and what the kill ratios were, the death ratios between Palestinian deaths and Israeli deaths. And we see that in general, it's about a 20-to-1 ratio over this last period. Now, one of the ways to look at Gaza, and I think it's the most useful way, is that it has been an open-air prison. I'm sure you've heard that. If you look at the Gaza Strip, it's not only surrounded by walls, but the ocean is also controlled so that fishermen cannot go out beyond a very limited distance that Israel government changes to punish or reward what it considers good behavior, but no more than 6 or 10 miles, which significantly reduces the catch. There was problems of undrinkable water. Israel controls the electricity. They collect the taxes. They control the population registry of the Gaza Strip. They control what food, what construction materials can go in, and they control the airwaves and the electromagnetic fields and the frequencies. Now, if you look at this picture at the Erez crossing, you can ask yourself, does that look like a crossing point between two areas, or does it look like a maximum security prison entrance? Now, actually, it's not at all a coincidence that this prison idea works, because Israel has not been able to figure out whether Gaza is inside or outside the country. Officially, the government will say, we left the Gaza Strip in 2005. We withdrew our military, withdrew our settlers. We're not occupying it anymore. But the definition of occupation in international law is that you control the area. Now, it doesn't mean you control everything that goes on inside it. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. But in what we see, when Israelis just talk normally, and certainly when the government talks normally, it actually acts as if Gaza is inside the country. Here you have a map that the Transportation Ministry puts out, and you see that the roads that they show include roads through the West Bank and through Gaza. Here you see a Jewish National Fund report on its activities. They have an article on the wonderful cooking that's being done in the Upper Galilee. And as just as an aside, they have a map showing the country, and you'll notice that the country includes Gaza and the West Bank as well as Golan. What I was most struck by, in September, Netanyahu spoke to the UN, and as he likes to do, he holds up little pictures and maps, and he held up a map of what he was proud to call the new Middle East, based on the normalization that would occur, he thought, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and added to Jordan and Egypt. And on it was Israel, and the map of Israel shows Gaza and the West, as well as the West Bank and Golan, is within the country. So in the ordinary language of Israelis and in Israeli politics, whether it's weather report maps or anything else, Gaza is treated as inside the country. Now, it's on the other hand, as I said, they don't want to treat the Arabs who live there as in the country. And officially, they don't want to be responsible for what goes on inside of Gaza. If you look at regular prisons in Israel, whether it's Ofer or Shikmar or Megiddo, Eshel, Eshkelon, that are filled with Palestinians, those prisons are, of course, manned by Israeli guards, and the wardens supervise the outside and prevent escape. There's a wall around the prison. But what happens inside the prison is mainly dominated by the prisoners themselves, the prisoner organizations. That's what happens in the prison yards and the prison cells is controlled by the prisoner organizations. And without those prisoner organizations, no prison can actually run very well. What I'm arguing is that before October, that what we have, what you're seeing in Gaza is a prison in which Hamas acts in many ways. It is an Islamic resistance movement. That's its name. It was produced by the Muslim Brotherhood in 1987 with the outbreak of the Intifada. As you may know, the Muslim Brotherhood was supported by and facilitated in its activities by the Israeli government in the 1970s that saw it as a counterweight to the PLO, with whom Israel didn't want to have any contact. The Hamas was also the winner of the only free election ever held in Gaza. We often hear that Hamas seized Gaza in 2007 by defeating Fatah violently. In fact, it won the election in 2006 over Fatah, to Hamas's surprise. And when the United States, Israel, and the PA tried to launch a coup against Hamas, then Hamas defeated them. That's what actually happened in 2007. It's also, of course, a terrorist organization, as we've seen, and it's a prisoner organization. It is all of the above. That is what Hamas has been. Now, how do you, I'm trying to, sorry, just a second. where do we go from here? How do we think about, in the middle of a catastrophe, what are we supposed to think about? I have traditionally tried to think not about solutions, because I don't believe that we can come to a picture that is so nice that I would say that the problems we have are an order of magnitude better than the ones we have today. I just don't think we're anywhere near that. I don't know how to get there. That's why I said I don't have a solution to the problem. But I would normally say that we should try our best to have better problems than we have. That's what I was saying until October 7th. I now am saying, in the midst of this catastrophe, that we can't even afford thinking that way, that we're really faced with the problem of can we prevent a catastrophe from becoming a super catastrophe? We have seen thousands of people die. We may see tens of thousands, but you could see hundreds of thousands. You could see ethnic cleansing. You could, on a Nakba scale, you could see a civil war in the West Bank between armed settlers and Palestinians desperate to defend themselves, who have neither the Palestinian forces nor the army to do so, but who can get guns from Jordan and from Arabs inside of Israel. So we are looking at, we also can, in the context of a war with Lebanon, and you get 100,000 rockets hitting Israeli cities, and you have Israeli Air Force destroying Lebanon in order to try to prevent that, of the possibility of Iranian involvement, of American involvement, and who knows where that will go. So the idea now to prevent another Nakba, to prevent this kind of super catastrophe, that's where my mind is, how to prevent that. I'd love to get to the world, and I hope we'll get there before too long, where we can go back to thinking about how we can get better problems, even if we're not next to getting a solution. Now, how do you think eventually about getting better problems? Let's look at these two options. First of all, I want to point out on this map over here, the red dots are Arab villages and communities that were evacuated and destroyed, and whose inhabitants became displaced persons and then refugees in 1948. Notice how almost all the dots in the southwest area surrounding Gaza are red. The green dots are Arab communities that were not evacuated, who remained one way or another. And these are Bedouin down here. These are Arabs who were surrounded in the Galilee and had nowhere to flee. These are what's called the Little Triangle, that was transferred by King Abdullah to Israeli control after the war ended. So that's one thing I want you to notice, how this area around Gaza was heavily settled by the Palestinians who are now in Gaza. So if you treat it, as I do, as one country, one state, ruling different areas in different ways, some as prisons, some as opportunities for just about everybody who lives in that area to have citizenship, some, as in the West Bank, where some people have citizenship and some people don't have citizenship, some in Jerusalem, where some people have citizenship nationally and other people only have citizenship in the municipality. Israel rules these areas in very different ways, but rules them all as a single state. This is a map taken from the Trump plan, which you probably know is a joke in almost every conceivable way. But there was one part of it that is worth remembering and commenting on, because I think it's unique in the last 40 or 50 years. This plan, which indicates that inside the green line, these green areas were to be areas where Palestinians from the Gaza Strip would be able to settle and create new communities. In other words, this was going to be a return of Palestinian refugees into Israel through the 1949 armistice lines, living in the northwestern Negev. Now, that idea that this area, which is relatively underpopulated by Jews, could be an area to absorb so many of the Gaza inhabitants, would fit with a vision of the future of integration of one country with Palestinians and Israelis living and Jews living, whether it's a binational state or one person, one vote. But I'll open that up as a theoretical possibility. If you close the prison, that is one possibility. You integrate the people who live there. You end the occupation by absorbing the West Bank and Gaza and their inhabitants. not just the Israelis who live there, but the Arabs as well. Now, the other possibility is that you treat the Gaza Strip as outside the country. You try to at least pretend it's outside the country, and that the West Bank is also outside the country. This means what I call restarting the peace process carousel. I know there's a hand up. I can't see you since I'm looking at my screen. If you don't mind, I think there's one more slide after this, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments and discussion. But I want you to take a look at this slide. A merry-go-round moves constantly. It goes round and round. It doesn't actually go anywhere. It stays in the same place. If you look at the peace process, starting all the way back in the late 60s with the Yaring Plan and the Rogers Plan, you had, and then Geneva Conference with Kissinger, your autonomy talks after the Camp David Accords. All of these included discussions about whether there would be discussions, and then discussions about what would be talked about in the discussions, and then an attempt to have discussions. And those would usually break down, but if you then did get to a little discussion, there was no agreement, or you had a change in the people who were in charge of the countries, and the process petered out. That applied to the Reagan Initiative in 1982-83, which was then canceled. It applies to the Madrid process after the first Gulf War. It applies to the Oslo process. It applies to the Annapolis Roadmap, 2002 to 2009, that whole process. It applied to Obama's attempt under George Mitchell in 2009, 2011 to start the peace process, to conduct it. And it applies to the Kerry Initiative of 2013 and 2014, which was in one way or another aimed at a two-state solution. And it applied to the Trump-Kushner attempt to move towards something which wouldn't perhaps just be the Abraham Accords. This is what I call the peace process carousel. And what I am anticipating, and this might be good news for Yossi, is that this will begin again. Not because anybody thinks it will actually succeed. It will do just what these others did. It will go round and round and grind to a halt in 3 or 4 years. But the idea that it might work, or maybe even the idea that they know it won't work, but people think it will or could, gives all politicians in Europe, in the United States, and most Israeli politicians, from Gideon Sa'ar over to Meretz, a political safe harbor. How can you say I'm anti-peace? I'm for the two-state solution. I don't like extreme policies. And I'm willing to talk, but of course we have our positions and they have theirs. But everybody has a very different, even Netanyahu at one point said he favored a two-state solution, when we know how much we can believe that. What I believe is going to happen is that it's irresistible to raise the two-state solution banner, whether it's possible or not. In fact, it's not possible. And for many, the fact that it's not possible is an incentive to start it, because you don't have to face up to the issues that really matter, which is granting equal political rights to everybody who lives between the river and the sea. That's the ultimate key to success, in my view, is the principle of equality. Most Israelis still don't want to face up to that. And if you can talk about, well, eventually we'll have a two-state solution, you can postpone that. Settlers, meanwhile, actually like the peace process carousel, because as soon as it starts moving, they start demanding more settlements, because they instill a false fear that there could be a Palestinian state. We have to grab every hill we can before it happens. Biden's formula offers us a way to look at what is coming, a way to exploit it. What is coming is another two-state solution merry-go-round. But Biden, since he became president, and his aides have used a formula. This is the version of the formula that he used when he spoke in Bethlehem, that he wants two states along the 1967 lines, where mutually agreed to swaps remain the best way to achieve equal measure of security, prosperity, freedom, and democracy for the Palestinians as well as Israelis. He has said this in different ways, but exactly the same thing, that what counts is the aspiration that Palestinians and Israelis will have equal measures of dignity, prosperity, freedom, and democracy and security. He's used different nouns. The idea of equality as America's goal and the two-state solution as one way to get it opens up the possibility that when the two-state solution negotiations fail, the United States can move back to the principle of equality and say, okay, how else can we get this objective of equal measures of security, prosperity, and freedom, etc., for Palestinians and Israelis? And that doesn't have to be through two states. That can be within one state in which everyone is equal. So what will happen as we look at this two-state merry-go-round starting is we have to start thinking about how it's going to fail. It needs to fail in a useful way, not in an unuseful way. And the way it can fail usefully, if it fails as it's seen to fail because of the unwillingness of Israelis to accept the principle of equality. That's the best way it could fail. Now, finally, I think this is my last slide. One of the mottos of my book is man plans and God laughs. Man tracht und God lacht. If that's true, you can't always tell that your plans are going to get what you want. But you can, in this world, act on your values. Act even though you don't see how that act is going to bring a complete solution. If it will bring more equality, if it will bring more peace, if it will bring more democracy, if it will bring more respect, mutual acceptance, do it. Act to increase opportunities for political participation for Palestinians, even if they oppose a two-state solution, even if they want to be involved in Israeli politics, even if they are for annexation. Act on behalf of liberal democracy, where the rights of groups as well as those of majorities are respected. Act to expand recognition for non-exclusivist forms of national self-determination. Act to deepen knowledge so people know more about the history and about one another. Act to increase equality. Conclude, Rabbi Tarfon from Pirkei Avot, it's not our duty to finish the work. I don't any longer believe I'm going to see a solution to this problem in my lifetime, and I dare say in none of our lifetimes. But we are not free to abandon that work. Thank you. I'm anxious to hear your comments, questions, discussion.
That was great. And Dick, since my computer is not working very well, if I blank out here, just take over, okay? Okay, thank you very much, Ian. That was unbelievably enlightening. And I guess we're ready for a Q&A. And so please use your...
well, people can unmute. I mean, we have a small group. We can just have a discussion. Yes, Yossi, you have your hand up.
Okay, Yossi's got his hand up. Why doesn't Yossi start? Excuse me, Uri did also, but I saw Yossi's first. So Yossi, you start.
I think Uri was first. I raised
Uri, you start, then
Well,
Yossi,
let's get both your comments on the floor.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you fine.
Okay, great. Ian, a great presentation. Thank you very much. I wanted to make a few comments. First of all, not every problem is solvable, especially political problem that's been there for at least 75, maybe more than 100 years, that clearly one side is not interested to solve it. And this is the Israeli governments. Definitely since 2009, I contend since 1948, the Israeli governments were not willing to pay the price for the solution. The price was too high politically or otherwise for them, and they refused, even though they knew it. And in a previous conversation, I showed this book to everybody. Before 1973, this booklet has about 36 different proposals for peaceful resolution. Some ideas here are so old that, you know, it's unbelievable, but they never died. So I think basically that the issue is not one state, two states, three states, confederation, and all that. The issue is very simple. There's no interest, at least on the Israeli side, to solve the issue in such a way. So they are willing to pay the price because they did this. and they decided that paying the price was actually worth it than taking the risk, whatever the risk is in their consideration. So that, despite all of it, I mean, I'm pessimistic. I've been pessimistic on this thing for a long time, and some of the people heard me talk about it. Unfortunately, not every political situation has a solution. Now, the fact that Biden resurrected the two-state solution, and it was kind of, wow, my God, something came from the dead. The thing is, would he be able to use the power of the United States to force it? And I don't think so, because he's got elections. So once you start using the leverage that the United States has in Israel, you're going to lose the election. So even with all his goodwill and intention, it's not going to happen. So I'm the pessimistic. That's what I just wanted to say. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Yossi. Thank you. Yossi.
Well, yeah, inside me, I might be also pessimistic, but I refuse to be pessimistic because otherwise,
Optimism of the will.
yeah, you know, otherwise, if there is no hope, then maybe we should just shut down this group, because talk about the problem and killing and suffering and this is not fun. Because if the only thing to talk about the tragedy and killing and then go home, why? I don't need this. I need something to have some hope. Maybe people said, oh, Yossi, you might be naive. Not, I'm not naive. And I tell you something. Right after World War II, 1945, if you ask most people in Europe, except in Germany, they might tell you that the solution is to annihilate the entire German people from the face of the earth as the way to fix Europe. Well, it didn't go this way. In Europe, whatever, I don't want to go to analysis how, they decided that a peaceful coexistence is the only way to live together. And they succeeded, with exception of the war in Yugoslavia, and now the war between Russia and Ukraine, but overall, it's a peaceful coexistence. And we're talking about after killing 50 million human beings in Europe. So I'm going back now to United States, because I believe at this point, there is no way at this point there can be any negotiation between the Israeli government or, let's say, the PLO/Palestinian Authority. The atmosphere today in Israel is so extreme that nobody even mentioned anymore two-state. Nobody mentioned any solution. Just going to war, annihilate Hamas, and not even talking about what will be the next step. This right now, the atmosphere. So what is left, if we like it or not, I'm very angry with the US government, because they're holding the key. They're holding the key. They have the leverage over the Israeli government to impose two states, because if they're going to impose something, it's going to be asking Israel to go back to 67 line. They're not going to tell them, you and Mahmoud Abbas going to join a government together with maybe some people from Islamic Jihad and maybe whatever leftover of Hamas. You know, it's not going to happen. It sounds this, but it's not going to happen, a joint government between. It's an illusion, even more the illusion that it's not going to happen.
So let's talk about this.
Okay, we can talk. But my point is that if anything can happen, it can come from United States and the rest of the West to impose, like they impose on Bosnia, on Serbia, to have some kind of arrangement in Bosnia so the killing will stop. And they impose it. It was not a negotiation between Milosevic and the Bosnians. They imposed this solution. The killing stopped. It's not perfect. I was in Bosnia. They have a basket case situation, but this is another story. But this is the only thing the way I see it. If they're not going to impose it, we're going to come next year and talk about more killing and more bloodbath.
Yossi, let Ian respond.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing I want to talk about Bosnia is a great example, because I was going to ask you where, what kind of solutions you've seen in other places that you would like to see in the Israel case. And here you came up with an example, and the United States, as you, I think, rightly point out, was crucial in imposing a settlement. Of course, the United States, in doing so, overcame the powerful Serbian lobby in the United States, didn't it? And you can say, what? There's a Serbian lobby in the United States? No, there is no Serbian lobby in the United States. There is nothing connected to the Bosnian-Serbian problem, anything like the Israel lobby in the United States. The Israel lobby in the United States is why that merry-go-round has gone around so many times. I have written an article going into great detail to show how at every point where there might have been a solution, or might have been some success, the lobby blocked it. And the advisors of Carter, of Bush, of so many of the presidents said, Clinton, you can't push any harder. You will lose domestically too much. It's just not worth it. And all of the presidents bought that argument because it's a correct argument. The United States has no president has a bigger interest in peace between Israelis and Palestinians than he or she does in winning an election or getting a domestic agenda achieved here. So we can't just pretend that the United States is going to act out of some kind of national interest or altruistic interest or worry about Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. They're only going to operate when the president thinks it's in his political interest to operate that way. And the political interest of at least the United States is to pretend that they are pursuing peace by pursuing the two-state illusion. That's when they can get support from both from liberal Democrats, from supporters of Israel, from Palestinian critics, some who support the two-state solution still. It's a political safe harbor. But I want to go back to another point that keeps coming up. The idea that nothing is possible. We can't do this. The mood in Israel means X. Go back to the United States in the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, and think about what life was like in the United States for Black Americans. Remember, they weren't slaves anymore, but they were suffered under Jim Crow. The New Deal did not really include Blacks, as you probably know. FDR got it through by agreeing with Southern Democrats not to extend the benefits like the GI Bill and other things to Blacks, not to integrate Blacks into the Army, and so on. In other words, no, if we were standing back then and we were thinking, might there be a multiracial democracy in the United States? Might there be someday an African-American president? No, we wouldn't have said that's impossible. We couldn't have done that. And it didn't happen because Blacks and whites negotiated with one another and came up with an agreement. That is not how this kind of democratization happens. It happens in much more indirect, convoluted ways, where people like George Wallace, who were the arch segregationist, was elected to his fourth term as governor by kissing Black babies and defeating an even a more segregationist, racist opponent on the Republican side. So that's the kind of situation we're looking at. We're not looking at a solution or a pretty picture in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. We're talking about a process of democratization of that country, which could take 50 years, could take generations. Just to nail this point, let me make a distinction here for you. There are two kinds of democratization. One kind was achieved in Romania after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ceausescu was killed. From one day, a very short time, he went from an autocracy to a democracy. Not a perfect democracy, but you went from an autocracy to a democracy. That's a democratization. But then there's another form of democratization when a partial group in the country has a democracy, whether they're whites in South Africa, whether they're white males in Britain or France or the United States, whether they're Jews in Israel, or whether they're Protestants in Britain as opposed to Catholic Irish. How do you extend that democracy to the stigmatized, feared, despised, hated outgroup? That takes a long time, and it doesn't come quickly or clearly. It comes usually when the dominant group splits and reaches out in some way for the dominated group to support it. We see that already happening inside of Israel. We see that the only chance for a moderate government of any kind to emerge is dependent on Arab parties. And everyone knows that now. At some point, moderates in Israel who don't want to be ruled by the Haredim or the Messianists will look at the West Bank and at East Jerusalem Arabs as whole blocks of voters that ought to be emancipated, so that moderate liberal values have a chance of winning out in Israel rather than only right-wing and ultra-religious, ultra-nationalist values. So I'm saying, stretch your time frame. Realize that we're in a terrible situation. It will take a long time to work out. We can only focus on now avoiding super catastrophe and trying in marginal ways to make things a little better than they are.
Is it my turn?
Samir, that's fine.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yes. Thank you for the great presentation. And I think that the one idea you brought about getting the Gazans to live in the Negev area, that's an idea President Sisi of Egypt just presented after talks about sending the Gazans to Egypt, and then he answered back officially, and he said it in public, that instead of sending the Gazans to Egypt, no, send them to the Negev. I mean,
very good. I hadn't heard
so
that yet.
I think that's a good idea, a good solution. I mean, for now, I think personally, yeah. I mean, do that, and then you settle the situation with Gaza. But ultimately, I believe in one secular democratic state, and I think that that is possible once you get one problem of Hamas and Gaza solved and get them to settle in the Negev, then that would be like the beginning of to get to the one democratic state. And also a reality, we know that it is one state right now, but it is one apartheid state. So the fight should be next will be for equality. Equality, one man, one vote, and that will be democracy. And also the next step may be to change the Netanyahu government, to bring it down. And there is already the pro-democracy movement. It is just like only the Jews are doing it. The next step should be Palestinian and Jews together. They work to bring down this government, make the change, so to have a better future for Jews and Palestinians to live, all Israelis, to live in one secular democratic state. And that might take, I mean, a couple of years, but it should be on the right track.
Yep.
And what, I mean, President Biden suggested, I mean, that's still a good idea to have two states, but I don't think that is going to happen because the Israeli lobby in this country will prevent it. I mean, they will fight it, and then his new elections comes in, and then it gets lost and whatever. So I don't think there is a future for the two states, but I believe that there is future for one secular democratic state.
Ron,
That's
thank you, Samir. Ron Lowe.
Hi there, and thank you for a fascinating presentation. I'm no scholar of the Mideast or of Palestine. I'm actually a Mexicanist by training, so I might be asking questions that everybody else in the group knows, but I'm kind of interested in knowing what happened to the Israeli left. It seems like there was a point where there was a very vibrant left, and if possibly kind of the multiple failures of the Netanyahu government in terms of trying to reform the judiciary, the intelligence failures will ultimately lead to the collapse of this coalition and create some kind of political opening, which will enable some new force to or coalition to emerge, which combines maybe elements of the left.
So let me answer that question the way I see it. What happened to the Israeli left? It was destroyed by the Israel lobby in the United States. And that's on one foot, that's what happened. Now, what do I mean by that? Because that's not what the Israel lobby ever intended. Many of the people in AIPAC, for example, used to associate with the Labor Party, although AIPAC became much more right-wing later. But they never really intended that. That wasn't their intention. Their intention was to make it impossible for American governments to put pressure on Israel in any way, so that Israel would be able to make its own decisions. That was AIPAC's policy. What was the effect of that policy was unintended. You had people who could have made fantastic prime ministers: Yossi Sarid, Shulamit Aloni, Chaim Marmon, Yossi Beilin. Why did they all fail? Why did none of them succeed? And the reason is because they had an argument which was, we must take advantage of the opportunity to get out of the West Bank and Gaza if we want to preserve a more or less democratic, liberal democratic Jewish state with a tolerable size Arab minority. If we don't do that, we're going to end up without a Jewish state, and it's going to be, or we're going to have something imposed on us by the United States that is much worse than we can get now. They kept arguing that over and over again. Be rational. Look at what the world will not let us have the West Bank and Gaza and all the aid and all the approval that the United States give us. That will be impossible. Well, the Israel lobby made it clear over and over again that that wasn't true. That no matter what the Israeli government did, no matter how many hundreds of thousands of settlers they put in the West Bank, no matter how the Palestinians were treated, no matter how many lies they told about Palestinians, the United States would still give them $3 billion a year, no matter what. So that meant that if you wanted to win elections in Israel, you won elections by appealing to the fantasies, the ambitions, the prejudices of more and more right-wing people in Israel, because the left had they were always wrong. They never, all their prophecies were all incorrect. So what Israeli politics could have become was deflected by the unintended consequences of the strength of the Israeli lobby into a kind of extreme right-wing Israel that we wouldn't have had to see if the United States was organized differently. But it's not organized differently. It's organized the way it's organized, and we have to live with that. And in that context, I want to say something a little more hopeful about the Israel lobby, and then go to Dick's comment or question. It's been striking me when you look at the younger people, how different their views are of Israel and the Palestinians than older people, older Jews. I can see it in my own family. I can see it in my students. You know, there's a political fact that the groups that have the most political influence, they tend to change, they affect what is considered public knowledge. Their views color what the media and what all politicians tend to say is true. So because of the power of the Israel lobby, newspaper articles and opinion columns are all written in a certain way that start out with the idea that, of course, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and we stand by it, blah, blah, blah. And then if you have something about the Palestinians, it's an afterthought. It's in the last paragraph. There's certain, and as time has gone on, American politicians have more and more had to say things about what is true in Israel that are absolutely ridiculously false, because AIPAC requires politicians to say these falsehoods. Now, it's getting to the point of absurdity, so that more and more politicians are being pressed to say that Hamas or the Palestinians are committing genocidal acts by chanting Palestine should be free, whereas the Israelis, who are killing 12,000 people more in 2 months than the Russians killed in Ukraine in 2 years, are doing fine. So what I'm thinking is that if this bubble of false information goes far enough into the realm of absurdity that it can bust suddenly, people can say, wait a minute, this is, especially after we find out when this dust settles, that the horrors we think have occurred in Gaza are only a fraction of what has actually occurred. So I'm wondering what's going to happen to that whole bubble of misinformation that's been building and building over the years, and whether there's any hope for a sudden transformation in a way that a lot of the American people see the Middle East. I'm just wondering. I'm throwing that out there as a possibility. Dick.
Okay. Well, my question is, I guess it builds on some of the things you said, and that's the role of the United States. I've heard often at these demonstrations that Israel is like the floating aircraft carrier, that it represents U.S. interests throughout the Middle East. And I can understand that argument, say, up until 1991, but I really can't see it now. I'm not aware that Israel played any role in putting down the Arab Spring. It plays no role in Yemen, played no role in Iraq. It does bomb airports in Syria, but right now, you have two U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups to defend Israel from two non-state actors. You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a non-state actor, and you have Hamas in Gaza, which is a non-state actor. Israel has tried for 5 weeks to defeat Hamas. It hasn't even come close. We've never heard any statistics on the number of Hamas fighters that Israel has killed. We only hear about non-combatants who Israel has killed.
No, you don't hear those from Israel. Israel has produced no estimates of non-combatants.
So the question I have is, well, is it just the Israel lobby? I can't believe that it's somehow some military interest of the United States to have Israel. I just don't see it anymore.
Right. So I can actually almost prove statistically to you that it is the Israel lobby. That's what accounts for it. And it's the way the American politics works. I can do it two ways. I can do it first by saying there are two problems in the world, that the United States position is 3 standard deviations from the rest of the world. Okay. One of them is Israel, where 190 countries vote one way, and the United States, Israel, and Samoa vote another way. What's the other problem that's like that? Where the United States position is 3 standard deviations from the rest of the world. Cuba, right. Now, that's interesting. What do they have in common? Is it because both have the same position on boycotts? No, we favor a boycott of Cuba. We oppose boycotts of Israel. So it's not the substance of the problem. We're the only country, along with Israel, that supports the boycott of Cuba. And we vote that way in the United Nations. So what is similar between those two issues? Yes, because that's what's decisive in American politics. The Florida lobby, the Cuba lobby in Florida, the Israel lobby in most of the country. So that's the first way I can respond, Dick. The second way is this. You mentioned 1991, the Cold War. The Cold War ends. That used to be that Organsky argument, the floating aircraft carrier, the $36 billion.
I still hear it all the time.
The $36 billion bargain. That was what his book was called. How much security the United States gets fighting the Soviet Union and containing communism. Once the Cold War ended, now look at my finger. Here's the amount of aid that the United States gave to Israel. Now the Cold War ends. It absolutely stays the same, keeps rising slightly over a decade and a half. In other words, if it had been a function of the Cold War, when the Cold War ended, it should have dropped. But it never had anything to do with the Cold War, and it doesn't today have anything to do with national interest. The aircraft carriers that you mentioned are not going to the Eastern Mediterranean to defend Israel. That's just what Biden wants people to think. They're there to prevent Israel from attacking Lebanon. Because if American planes are flying around Lebanon, or might fly around Israel, Israel can't tangle with that space. what Biden went to Israel primarily to stop a war between Israel and Lebanon and to implicate Israel in implicate the United States in anything Israel did afterwards, thereby making it very difficult for Netanyahu to attack Lebanon, which is what so much of his cabinet wanted to do, to put Hamas aside and try to destroy Hezbollah. I can tell you that because there was a mistake made in a casual mistake made. There was a warning put out by one of the security services that Israelis should prepare their shelters with 3 days of food and water. 72 hours. 72 hours is the amount of time that the Israeli Air Force believes it will need to destroy enough of the Lebanese forces, of the Hezbollah forces, to protect Israel. So those 72 hours in which rockets will rain down in Israel, they have to be. So there was an anticipation that that was going to happen. I think Biden stopped it. I'm not 100% certain of this. I'm not 100% certain it's still not going to happen. But that's how I see those aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean.
We have a few more questions.
Gilatia?
My name is Gila, and I don't really know how I got this email on but I'm happy because, I think it's really important to think about peace. And so I just like to know, even for like 1 minute, if it's possible, to explain what this meeting is about. I just got the email, and because as I said, I'm very interested about what's going on, and I just think we need to do something because the world is becoming very, very unsafe for everybody, and we should just think how we could bring people together. So
well, I think people who are in this group have worked for a long time to try to bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And the main way that they've tried to do that is to convince Israelis and Palestinians to accept 2 states, which Israel would withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and allow a Palestinian state to be created that would live in peace of some sort with Israel. But that idea has stopped being pursued for a long time. So many attempts to do it failed because governments in Israel and in the United States were just unwilling to stop what they really wanted to do in Israel, which was to settle the territories and keep them. So you keep getting more and more obstructionist governments in Israel. So then people like me have said, actually, you're never going to be able to get this negotiated solution. It's one country. The problem is making it democratic now, and that's hard. How do you make a country democratic when it's divided between a group that feels it is the rightful owners of the country and another group that it looks down on, fears, despises, stigmatizes? That's a very difficult kind of democratization. And in the midst of, then you add the war, and people like me and in this group are just wondering what's the implications of these horrors for whatever ideas we did have to begin with, and whatever hopes we did have, whether they were the hopes for democratization or the hopes for 2 states. And one of the things that may come out of this discussion is, yes, there's likely to be a revving up attempt to bring 2 states to do 2-state negotiations. But my argument is that is definitely going to fail, but we could make it fail in a useful way. It focuses on the real problem, in my view, which is how do you get equality for all the people who live in a single state that is not democratic, but exists between the river and the sea. On one foot, that's what happened.
yeah, thank you.
Another idea.
Samir.
Yeah, I have another idea that occurred to me, that because now when they are talking about Jewish state, something, should be said to all Israelis that the Jewish state is bad for the Jews. And that should be maybe in a big billboard in the center of Tel Aviv to tell Israelis, Jewish state is bad for the Jews. They have to get that.
Well, it is. I think we're going to wrap things up now. I think that is a very important topic, a very difficult topic. I find on my own campus, there's a huge gap between things that go on in the campus, which are emotional, but actually quite intensive and useful discussions going on. But the parents, especially the Jewish parents, are going crazy, thinking that their children are in danger, which is not true. And yet there are attacks on Palestinians, there are attacks on Jews, or anti-Semitic incidents all over the country. My feeling is that what we're seeing is that the behavior of a state that calls itself Jewish unleashes anti-Semitic acts throughout the world at a much higher level than would be the case if you didn't have a state that called itself Jewish acting in these ways. But even the idea, but instead, what we find are institutions and groups who think that it's anti-Semitism is being caused, is growing because people are more and more anti-Semitic. It's a delicate thing to say exactly what is the contribution to the rise in anti-Semitic incidents by Israel's behavior, as opposed to a growth in anti-Semitism itself. These are very difficult conversations. In a lot of it, in my campus, and I'm involved in them, how you define anti-Semitism is very, very important.
What campus are you on?
University of Pennsylvania, where there's
Sorry.
been a lot of news lately.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Listen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I know there are a couple more questions, but it's on the late side for me.
But when is it going to happen again, and how we could let our friends know about this?
Well, I'll let the organizers tell you. I'll just say to everyone that if you are not on my distribution list and you would like to receive publications, interviews, lectures that I do, videos, send me your email address and I'll put you on that distribution list. My email address is easy to find. Just Google me, ilustick@gmail.com would be an easy one.
Thank you.
And so with that, I will bid you adieu. And chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek.
مع السلامة. مرة. باي باي.
Bye-bye.
To answer your question, I have compiled a large list, and Jeff has a large list, so you probably got added through one of those two lists. So we'll be sure to let you know about our future ones. Jeff can make an announcement of what we have in store over the next 3 months. We do it about once a month.
Okay.
Yeah, let me put that on. Here is what we have coming up.
Next month.
In a month from now, on December 18th, starting at 8 o'clock, we have a group called Looking the Occupation in the Eye. They're trying to bring the harsh truth to the Israeli public. These are people who are Israelis, so they're going to be getting up at 4 in the morning or 3 in the morning to deal with us at 4 in the morning their time. So that's December 18th. That's a month from now. 2 months from now, we have Emily Schaefer Obermann again. She's spoken to us before. She's a civil rights lawyer. She now works for Global Echo in Washington, D.C. And she's going to talk about their latest criminal complaints about corporations accused of aiding these settlements. A month beyond that, on February 19th at 7 o'clock, our normal time, Joseph Avisar, who is with us now, he actually wanted to erect a billboard in Tel Aviv saying, Israel.
The Jewish state is bad for the
Joseph,
Jews.
are you still there? Can you give me what the billboard said?
The Jewish state is bad for the Jews.
Yeah, a Jewish state is bad for Jews. That's what the billboard.
Anyway, Yosef will be our speaker on February 19th, and he has a whole series of videos he's made describing what is wrong with Israel's democracy and how to make it into a better place for people living there. And he's going to expand on that. So those are the three things coming up. People from Israel, 8 p.m. Emily Schaefer Overman, she'll actually be starting at 6 because she's be coming from the East Coast from Washington, D.C. And then Joseph Avasar at a normal 7 o'clock time in February. Hope you all can come to that. And regardless of what Ian said, Yossi and I will be out at the Federal Building again next Sunday, holding up our sign.
Good.
Happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
So I thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
And
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving. Thank you.
hope to see you in December.
Can I just give me a little bit to answer Samir, because I think
Bye-bye.
something with
Go
this
ahead.
message, I think it's very wrong.